In the quiet of a Virginia Beach autumn afternoon, amidst the yellowed pages of an abandoned medical file, a manuscript was discovered that would forever alter our understanding of death and grief. The typewritten pages, marked by time and kept secret for over 70 years, contained the final words of Edgar Cayce, the man known as the Sleeping Prophet, an intimate and revolutionary account his own foundations chose to keep hidden from the world. The discovery was accidental, occurring while researchers were organizing the personal belongings of Gladys Davis Turner, Cayce's closest secretary, who passed away in 1986. Among family correspondence and administrative documents, they found a sealed wooden box containing not only handwritten pages, but also a small wax cylinder recording, a testament Cayce had left as his final spiritual legacy, recorded just 3 weeks before his death in January 1945. What made this discovery even more extraordinary was its content. Unlike the thousands of psychic readings Cayce performed throughout his life, always in a deep trance, this recording had been made fully conscious, his voice clear and measured, as if he knew he was leaving his most important words for posterity. The handwritten title on the manuscript's cover was straightforward and unsettling: "On What Happens When We Mourn the Departed, a Final Confession." Edgar Cayce had always been a private man regarding his own mystical experiences when awake. Publicly, he maintained the image of a simple photographer and Sunday school teacher who merely lent his body for higher forces to speak through him during trances, but in those final days of his earthly life, something had shifted. The visions that had accompanied him since childhood had intensified, and he had begun to perceive subtle patterns in the interaction between the visible and invisible worlds, patterns he had never dared to share publicly. The recording began with a deep sigh, followed by Cayce's familiar voice, but imbued with a gravity that transcended his usual lectures. He spoke of the letters he had received over the years, thousands of them, from grieving people seeking comfort after losing loved ones. But there was something in these correspondences that deeply troubled him, something that only he, with his heightened sensitivity to the spiritual planes, could perceive. For decades, Cayce had observed a disturbing phenomenon in his visions. When he performed readings for people who had recently lost family members, he frequently saw the spirits of the deceased in a specific way, not at peace in the higher planes, as he expected, but in a state of unrest, as if something were holding them tethered to the dimensions closest to Earth. Initially, he attributed this to the natural process of spiritual transition, but over time he began to notice a disturbing pattern. The spirits that remained longest in this intermediate state were precisely those whose living relatives manifested the most intense and prolonged grief. The first time Cayce had clearly perceived this connection was during a reading in 1923 for a mother who had lost her 7-year-old son in an accident. While in a trance, he saw the boy not in the celestial gardens he usually described, but in a kind of luminous mist, constantly looking down, as if something were calling him back to earth. When Cayce emerged from the trance and reported the vision, the mother burst into tears, confessing that she spent hours every day weeping and calling for her son, begging him to return. This experience marked the beginning of a silent spiritual investigation that Cayce conducted over the next 22 years. He began to pay special attention to cases of prolonged grief, observing how the emotional state of the living seemed to directly influence the spiritual journey of the dead. What he discovered disturbed him so much that he never dared to share his conclusions publicly, fearing they might be misinterpreted or cause even more suffering to grieving people. In the recording, Cayce revealed that he had developed a revolutionary theory about the nature of grief and its influence on the spiritual planes. According to his observations, the tears shed for the dead were not simply expressions of longing, they literally created ethereal cords that bound the spirits of the deceased to the earthly dimensions. The more intense and desperate the weeping, the stronger this connection became, making it difficult or even impossible for the spirit to continue its natural journey towards the higher planes of existence. Cayce described these cords as threads of golden light stained with sorrow, which he could perceive during his deepest visions. They extended from the hearts of the bereaved to a specific region of the deceased's etheric body, keeping them anchored in an intermediate zone he called the Valley of Unshed Tears, a dimensional plane where spirits remain conscious of both the world of the living and the world of the dead, but unable to fully inhabit either. Most disturbing of all, according to Cayce's account, was that the spirits of the dead themselves were aware of this situation. They could feel every tear shed for them, every cry of longing, every desperate plea for them to return. And moved by the love they still felt for their living relatives, many chose to remain in this intermediate state, even knowing that this meant delaying their own spiritual evolution. Cayce then recounted a specific experience he had experienced a few months before recording his final testimony. During a reading for a widow who had lost her husband in World War II, he was surprised by a particularly vivid vision. He saw the spirit of the dead soldier not in the celestial battlefields he usually described for those who perished in war, but in a kind of twilight garden, where he walked slowly among leafless trees, constantly looking towards a luminous window that showed his wife weeping alone at home. The astonishing discoveries of Dr. Elias Thorne, a spiritual perspective on grief. What most impressed Dr. Elias Thorne was the observation that the deceased soldier seemed to be spiritually aging. His ethereal form showed signs of wear, as if the forced stay in that intermediate plane was corroding his spiritual essence. It was as if he were sacrificing his own inner luminosity to remain near his grieving wife, responding to her desperate calls with his ethereal presence. This vision marked a definitive turning point in Thorne's spiritual understanding. He realized that love, in its purest form, could sometimes become a prison when manifested through despair and denial of death. Spirits of the departed, moved by the same love that had bound them to the living during their earthly existence, often chose to remain trapped in the lower planes to protect or console their bereaved loved ones, even knowing that this meant delaying their own spiritual journey. It was at this point in the recording that Thorne made an even deeper revelation. He had begun to realize that some spirits, after remaining for a long time in this intermediate state responding to the calls of the living, began to gradually lose their connection with the higher planes. It was as if the constant return to earthly dimensions through the etheric cords created by prolonged grief began to erase their memories of the celestial spheres and their greater evolutionary purpose. These spirits, according to Thorne, gradually became more earthly in their essence, losing the luminosity characteristic of beings who had completed the transition to the higher planes. Some ended up becoming what he called love ghosts, entities trapped between worlds, sustained only by emotional ties with the living, but increasingly distant from their true spiritual nature. The most disturbing discovery of all came when Thorne realized that this phenomenon did not only affect the recently deceased. During a particularly profound reading, he saw spirits who had departed decades earlier, still trapped in the intermediate planes because living family members continued to mourn them with the same intensity as the first day. Entire generations of families unknowingly kept their deceased ancestors trapped through prolonged mourning rituals, obsessive visits to graves, and constant denial of the reality of death. It was at this point in the narrative that Thorne introduced the most revolutionary concept of his entire testimony, the idea that there is a sacred way to mourn the dead, which honors their memory without creating etheric bonds that bind them to the earthly planes. He described this practice as tears of liberation, a weeping that expresses gratitude for the shared life, acknowledgement of the continuity of spiritual existence, and above all, the sincere desire that the deceased continue their journey towards the higher planes of evolution. According to Thorne, these tears of liberation had an entirely different energetic quality from desperate mourning. In his visions, they appeared as drops of crystalline light that, instead of creating etheric cords of connection, formed temporary bridges of light that allowed the spirits of the dead to send comfort and guidance to the living, but without hindering their own evolutionary journey. Those who follow the deeper mysteries of human existence and seek to understand the secrets that connect life and death will find here revelations that have been kept hidden for decades. If you feel there is more beyond what we are conventionally taught about the destiny of the soul, subscribe to our channel to continue receiving reports like this, discoveries that reveal the most intimate truths about our spiritual journey, based on documents and testimonies that have finally come to light after years of silence. The recording continued with Thorne, recounting a personal experience he had had just a few months earlier. His own mother had passed away a few years earlier, and he confessed that even with all his spiritual knowledge, he had gone through a period of intense grief, crying frequently, and calling out to her during his nightly prayers. It was during one of these nights of mourning that he had a vision that would forever change his understanding of the nature of grief. He saw his mother not in the celestial gardens where he expected to find her, but in a room of golden light where she sat, looking through an ethereal window that showed him crying. What most impressed him was that she seemed to be waiting, as if her spiritual journey had been paused to respond to his calls of sadness. When he finally understood what was happening, Thorn completely changed the nature of his prayers, replacing lamentations with blessings of liberation and gratitude. The result was immediate and profound. In the next vision, he saw his mother walking through a dazzling garden of light, surrounded by other luminous beings, with an expression of peace and joy that he had never perceived before. She turned one last time in his direction, and without words, transmitted a message that he described as the purest feeling of liberated love I had ever experienced. This personal experience led Thorn to develop what he called the spiritual protocol for sacred mourning, a practice that he had begun to discreetly teach to a few close people, but which he had never publicly documented. The protocol involved three distinct phases: the acknowledgement of loss, the conscious expression of gratitude for the shared life, and finally, the deliberate act of liberating the spirit of the deceased through a specific prayer. The liberation prayer that Thorn had developed was particularly powerful. He instructed the mourners to imagine the spirit of the deceased surrounded by golden light, and then to pronounce words that expressed not only love but also the sincere desire that the spirit continue its evolutionary journey without worrying about those left behind. It was a way of giving permission for the deceased to depart completely, freeing them from any sense of responsibility or need to remain close to the living. Dr. Elias Thorn's accounts described extraordinary results from this practice. People who had spent years trapped in paralyzing grief began to feel an inexplicable peace after performing the liberation protocol. More importantly, during subsequent readings, Thorn could perceive that the spirits of the deceased had indeed moved to higher planes, where they shone with a luminosity he described as the light of spiritual freedom. But perhaps the most profound revelation in Thorn's entire testimony was his understanding of the true nature of the connection between the living and the dead. He had discovered that when the spirits of the deceased were able to freely pursue their evolution, they became even more capable of offering guidance and protection to the living. It was as if liberation from the intermediate planes gave them access to higher dimensions of wisdom and spiritual power, which they could then channel back to their loved ones far more effectively. Thorn described these evolved spirits as luminous guardians, beings who had transcended the need to remain bound to earthly planes, but who maintained a loving and protective connection with those they had left behind. The fundamental difference was that this connection no longer depended on the desperate emotional bonds created by grief, but on a pure spiritual connection based on unconditional love and a mutual desire for evolutionary growth. During his final months, Thorn had begun to perceive signs that his own earthly time was drawing to a close. The visions that had accompanied him since childhood had intensified dramatically, and he had begun to see not only the spiritual planes, but also luminous figures who seemed to be preparing something for him. It was as if he was gradually being called to a transition that he recognized as inevitable and sacred. It was during this period of spiritual preparation that Thorn experienced the transcendental experience he described as the culmination of his entire mystical journey. On a particularly tranquil evening, while meditating in his study, he was suddenly transported to what he described as the Hall of Sacred Farewells, a dimensional space where spirits about to reincarnate or depart definitively from Earth met one last time with those they had left behind. In this ethereal hall, Thorn witnessed scenes that completely changed his understanding of the nature of death and rebirth. He saw spirits of recently deceased people being greeted by family members who had passed before them, but not in the sentimental way we usually imagine. It was a meeting of mutual recognition, where tears of joy replaced tears of sorrow, and where each spirit celebrated the journey completed by the other. Most impressively, these celestial encounters only happened when everyone involved had been truly liberated by the living. Spirits still bound to the intermediate planes by the etheric cords of prolonged grief could not access this sacred hall. They remained in the lower dimensions, awaiting the moment when their earthly loved ones understood the importance of liberating them through sacred grief. Thorn also witnessed something even deeper. Spirits of people who had died decades ago finally managing to ascend to the Hall of Farewells when living family members, still on Earth, performed liberation rituals even years after physical death. It was as if it was never too late to truly liberate a deceased loved one, allowing them to continue their complete evolutionary journey. The vision culminated when Thorn realized that he himself was being observed by a luminous figure, whom he immediately recognized as his future spiritual self, the version of himself that would exist after his own earthly transition. This figure conveyed to him, without words, a profound understanding of his role as a bridge between the worlds of the living and the dead, and of the importance of sharing these revelations before his departure. It was after this transcendental experience that Thorn decided to record his final testimony, knowing that his words could transform how humanity understands death and grief. He realized he had been chosen to reveal these secrets not only to comfort the bereaved, but to liberate generations of spirits who remain trapped in the intermediate planes, due to the living family members' misunderstanding of the true nature of love after death. In the final part of his recording, Thorn offered practical instructions for those who wished to practice sacred grief. He emphasized that it was not about suppressing the natural sadness of loss, but about transforming that sadness into an instrument of spiritual liberation. The process began with the recognition that physical death is only a transition, not an end, and that the greatest act of love we can offer our dead is to encourage them to continue their evolutionary journey without worrying about us. Thorn instructed that whenever intense longing manifested, the bereaved person should stop and visualize the spirit of the deceased surrounded by golden light, mentally expressing gratitude for the shared life, and declaring their wish that the spirit find peace and evolution on the higher planes. It was important, he said, to replace phrases like "come back to me" or "don't leave me" with blessings like "go in peace and find your light." He also recommended the practice of liberation conversations, regular moments where the bereaved person would speak to the spirit of the deceased, not to call them back, but to share love, gratitude, and encouragement for their spiritual journey. These conversations should always end with an explicit statement of liberation, such as "you are free to continue your journey, and I will be all right." Thorn warned that the process of true liberation could take time, especially for those who had maintained prolonged grief for years, but he assured that the spirits of the deceased were infinitely patient and understanding, and that they would respond immediately to any genuine movement toward liberation, no matter how long it had been since physical death. The recording concluded with a profoundly moving reflection on the ultimate purpose of the human experience. Dr. Elias Thorn spoke of his understanding that we are born not only to learn and evolve individually, but also to learn to love in a way that promotes the evolution of all around us, including those who depart before us. Sacred grief, he asserted, was one of the highest expressions of this evolutionary love, as it allowed us to continue serving our loved ones even after their physical death, helping them reach the higher planes of existence. His final words on the recording were particularly prophetic, considering he would pass away only 3 weeks later. Dr. Thorn expressed gratitude for being chosen to serve as a channel between worlds, and declared his confidence that when his own time came to depart, those he left behind would understand the importance of releasing him through sacred grief, allowing him to continue his work of spiritual service from the higher planes. The manuscript accompanying the recording contained additional details about Dr. Thorn's visions, including specific descriptions of the different dimensional planes where the spirits of the deceased temporarily resided, depending on the type of grief their living relatives maintained for them. Most fascinating was his description of what he called the Garden of Transformed Tears, a special celestial plane where resided the spirits who had been released through sacred grief, and from where they could send signs of comfort and guidance to the living without hindering their own evolution. Dr. Thorne described these signs as subtle yet profoundly meaningful manifestations, the unexpected appearance of objects that belonged to the deceased, particularly vivid and consoling dreams, the presence of animals or birds during moments of deep sorrow, and especially the sudden feeling of peace and understanding that often arose after the practice of sacred grief. These signs, he said, were the way released spirits confirmed that they had received the blessings of liberation, and that they were indeed continuing their evolutionary journey in peace. Perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Dr. Thorne's testimony was his assertion that the practice of sacred grief could transform not only the individual experience of loss, but the very nature of death in humanity's collective consciousness. He envisioned a future where death would be understood not as a tragedy to be desperately mourned, but as a spiritual graduation to be celebrated with love and wisdom. In this future envisioned by Dr. Thorne, families would develop rituals of conscious farewell for their deceased loved ones, ceremonies that would honor the life lived while actively encouraging the spirit to continue its evolutionary journey. Entire communities would unite to support the bereaved not only in the process of accepting loss, but in the active practice of spiritually liberating the deceased. The discovery of this final testimony of Edgar Cayce offers a completely new perspective on one of the most universal aspects of the human experience. His revelations suggest that true love for our dead is not expressed through trying to keep them close to us, but through the courage to release them so they can reach their maximum spiritual potential. It's a lesson that transcends religions and cultures, offering a universal understanding of the eternal nature of consciousness and the evolutionary purpose of existence. The implications of these revelations are profound and transformative. If Dr. Thorne was correct in his observations, then millions of spirits around the world may be trapped in intermediate planes due to the prolonged grief of their living relatives. But his discoveries also offer hope, suggesting that it is never too late to truly liberate those we love, allowing them to continue their sacred journey toward the infinite light that awaits every soul that completes its earthly mission. Dr. Thorne's final testimony invites us to fundamentally rethink our relationship with death and grief, offering us practical tools to transform our sorrow into an instrument of spiritual liberation. It is a discovery that promises to revolutionize not only how we deal with loss, but how we understand the greater purpose of human life, to learn to love in a way that promotes the eternal evolution of all souls, with whom we share our journey through eternity. As the last words of the recording faded into silence, the researchers who made this extraordinary discovery understood that they had found more than a historical document. They had discovered a spiritual map for one of the most important journeys any human being can undertake, the journey of learning to love their dead with enough wisdom to release them and themselves toward the eternal light that is the ultimate destination of every consciousness that dares to evolve beyond the limitations of the physical world.